You begin with an assumption so familiar that you rarely pause to question it. You believe that if an idea appears coherent, it must be true, and if reasoning feels clear, it must be reliable. But when you look more closely, even for a moment, you notice that this confidence has no confirmed foundation. It survives only because it has never been examined deeply. Al-Ghazali confronted this same problem at the start of his inquiry. He realized that knowledge is often accepted not because it has been verified, but because the mind is accustomed to trusting itself. When you turn this lens inward, you see how rarely you verify the mechanism through which you believe you understand. Here the question arises: if certainty depends on the mind, how do you verify the mind itself? In 11th century Baghdad, intellectual life revolved around debate, analysis, and disciplined reasoning. Scholars defended doctrines, philosophers refined systems, mystics searched for an inner ground of truth. It was an environment overflowing with ideas and competing claims. Al-Ghazali stood at the center of this atmosphere, respected for his mastery of argument. Yet he sensed an unspoken assumption beneath it all. Every argument, no matter how brilliant, relied on a mind that had never proven its own reliability. This raised a quiet question: if the foundation remains unexamined, can the structure built upon it ever be stable? Al-Ghazali experienced a turning point when he examined the roots of his certainty. Sensory knowledge, once trusted, revealed its vulnerability. Sight can distort, memory can alter, and the mind can mistake interpretation for observation. Rational knowledge appeared more secure, but he noticed that logic depends on premises the mind accepts without questioning their origin. You feel the same tension when you consider how many beliefs you accept simply because they are familiar. You inherit frameworks and assume coherence means truth. But once this assumption is exposed, you realize how easily the mind can deceive itself while believing it is precise. This leads to the deeper question: when doubt reaches the foundations of knowledge, what remains unquestionable? Reason organizes thought, distinguishes patterns, and constructs explanations. It is powerful, but Al-Ghazali observed that it cannot verify the reliability of the mind using the mind itself. Reason can form arguments, but it cannot reach beyond the conditions that make argument possible. When you inspect your own reliance on reasoning, you notice that convincing ideas often feel valid because they follow predictable structures, not because they reveal reality. You are persuaded by familiarity and fluency long before you verify the content. This exposure leads to a sober realization: if reason rests on assumptions it cannot justify, can it provide the certainty it promises? You rely on perception because it feels immediate. You trust what you see, hear, and remember because the experience seems direct. But Al-Ghazali investigated the limits of the senses and found them incomplete. What appears stable can shift under different conditions. What seems accurate may depend on perspective. What feels certain may be shaped by expectation. When you reflect on your own experience, you recall moments when perception contradicted itself. You notice how easily you accept impressions without questioning how they formed. You see how perception depends on the mind's interpretation, and how interpretation depends on assumptions you rarely notice. Al-Ghazali concluded that sensory knowledge cannot serve as an absolute foundation because it is influenced by countless variables, many of which lie outside awareness. You begin to understand that what feels immediate is not always accurate, and what feels clear may simply be habitual. This raises another question. If waking corrects the mistakes of dreaming, what corrects the mistakes of waking? Once the limits of perception and logic became clear, Al-Ghazali turned toward a subtler issue: the mind's automatic trust in itself. You assume your thoughts arise from clarity, yet many arise from repetition, habit, or internal momentum. You assume your conclusions reflect truth, but they often reflect preference. You believe you understand your own thinking, But awareness of thought is not the same as understanding its origin. Al-Ghazali recognized this hidden layer. The mind does not merely process information, it also constructs the framework through which information is filtered. It often mistakes coherence for truth, confidence for accuracy, and familiarity for certainty. When you examine your own thoughts with this lens, you notice how easily the mind defends what it already believes. You see how quickly it rejects ideas that challenge its stability. You observe how thought reinforces itself without verifying anything beyond itself. This is the deeper veil. The mind trusts itself because it cannot imagine an alternative. But this trust remains unproven. The question arises quietly: if the mind is both judge and witness, how do you distinguish insight from illusion? Al-Ghazali reached a turning point when he realized that the mind cannot verify its own foundation. Rational systems, sensory observations, and internal reflections all depended on a structure that could not examine itself without circularity. This understanding did not lead to despair but to clarity. Certainty cannot come from the mind alone. When you reflect on this, you see how your own pursuit of certainty often relies on expanding analysis rather than questioning the basis of analysis itself. You attempt to refine arguments, collect more information, or correct errors, assuming that greater precision will bring stability. But the core problem remains. The instrument performing the inquiry remains unverified. Recognizing the limits of thought does not weaken understanding. It purifies it. You begin to see that thought can describe, compare, and analyze, but it cannot observe its own origin. It depends on awareness that precedes it. This insight marks the beginning of a new form of clarity, one that does not depend on conceptual mastery but on recognizing the boundary between thought and the ground from which thought arises. Here, a deeper question takes shape. If thought cannot reach its origin, what can? Al-Ghazali distinguished between two forms of knowing. The first is conceptual understanding, which relies on reasoning, categorization, and interpretation. This form is useful but limited by the conditions of thought. The second is direct insight, which does not depend on argument but on awareness itself. Direct insight is not a mysterious experience. It is the clarity that arises when thought becomes quiet enough to be observed. It is recognition without commentary, understanding without explanation, and certainty that does not arise from proof. Al-Ghazali saw that this form of knowing provides stability because it is grounded not in the mind's constructions but in awareness that perceives the mind. When you consider this distinction, you notice how often thinking interferes with clarity rather than enabling it. You see how explanations can obscure the very truth they attempt to describe. You begin to recognize that awareness does not need to think in order to know. It simply sees. This recognition shifts your understanding. Instead of asking thought to prove what lies beyond thought, you allow awareness to reveal what thinking could never reach. Here another question emerges. If awareness sees without thought, then what purpose does thought serve? Having distinguished between conceptual knowledge and direct insight, Al-Ghazali integrated them rather than opposing them. He did not reject reason, he clarified its scope. Reason organizes the world, navigates relationships, and guides decision-making. But it cannot serve as the ultimate ground of certainty. When you understand this distinction, your relationship with thought changes. You no longer expect argument to provide absolute truth. Instead, you use reason as a functional tool while recognizing that its validity depends on the deeper awareness that perceives it. This shift dissolves the earlier conflict between doubt and certainty. Doubt no longer threatens understanding because understanding does not depend on argument alone. Certainty becomes an aspect of direct insight, while reason becomes its instrument rather than its source. You begin to see that the mind can participate in truth but cannot generate it. You understand that clarity arises not from the mind's authority but from awareness that observes both certainty and uncertainty without being disturbed by either. This leads to a final question. If certainty arises beyond thought, why does thought insist on claiming it? At the end of the inquiry, you arrive at a simple recognition. The mind cannot observe its own origin. It can explore ideas, question assumptions, and refine concepts, but it remains within the boundaries of its own structure. Awareness, however, is not bound by these limits. It observes the mind, its movements, its doubts, and its conclusions. When this becomes clear, thinking settles into its rightful place. It no longer attempts to ground itself. It no longer tries to secure certainty through argument. Instead, it becomes quiet. In this quietness, understanding does not need to be justified. It reveals itself without effort. Here, the search concludes. If the mind cannot see itself, who is it that sees the mind?